I want you to try a little visualization experiment with me for a second. Let's say it's 11 p.m.
The classic doom scrolling hour.
Exactly. You are lying in bed, the lights are off, but the room is glowing blue because you've got your phone about 6 inches from your face.
We have all been there.
Right. And you are just scrolling. You watch a clip of some politician screaming at a recorder, then you swipe, and you're suddenly looking at a comment section that it looks like an absolute war zone.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
It really is. You swipe again, maybe you see a terrifying graph about the national debt, and you feel anxious, you feel wired, but mostly you just feel completely powerless.
Which is pretty much the modern condition at this point. I mean, we are drowning in all this information, but we are totally starving for agency.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So when you just shake that off, close your eyes and imagine a front porch instead,
Okay, a front porch.
a real one.
Yep.
Maybe it has those wooden slats that creak a little bit when you step on them. There's a swing. Right. You are sitting there, maybe with a cup of coffee or an iced tea, and you are not worrying about what is happening in Washington, D.C. or trending online. You're just watching your actual neighbor walk their dog.
You're actually present.
You're thinking about the pothole down your street or the local school budget, or you're just waving at the mail carrier. It feels grounded.
It feels human, really, and manageable.
That shift, moving from the blue light of that screen to the wooden slats of the front porch, that is the central metaphor of what we are covering today. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of documents, all revolving around something called the Jeffersonian community.
And right off the bat, we should probably clarify what that actually is, because, hearing the word Jeffersonian, it can kind of sound like a history fan club.
Or some kind of colonial reenactment society.
Exactly. But the source material describes this entirely differently. It calls it a living ecosystem. It is a national, member-driven network that is actively trying to shift the center of gravity in American life.
And we have a lot of material to go through for this deep dive. We have network manifestos, we have breakdowns of their membership resources, and we have excerpts from a book they reference heavily titled MAGA 2.0.
It is a really dense stack of reading.
It is. But the core mission across all these documents seems to be diagnosing a very specific sickness in our culture. They actually call it the trade-off between local accountability and national spectacle.
Yeah, that word spectacle is really crucial in these texts. The documents argue that we have essentially turned our politics into reality TV.
Just pure entertainment.
Right, a spectacle where we are all just passive audience members. We watch, we get angry, we post our reactions online, but we do not actually do anything that improves our daily reality.
It really does feel like we are just fans in a stadium, screaming at the players on the field rather than actually playing the game ourselves.
Precisely. And the Jeffersonian community is basically making the argument that you need to stop watching the game. You need to go build your own field.
Which brings us to the core philosophy here.
Right. The core belief in these texts is that self-government is not something that happens in a marble building 500 miles away from now. It starts at home.
In families, schools, churches, neighborhoods.
Exactly. So our goal for this deep dive is to really unpack this and figure out if this is just a bunch of high-minded political theory, or if the documents actually outline a real plan to turn that front porch metaphor into reality.
Let's start with the philosophy then, because their branding is very specific. They talk constantly about moving from the spectacle to the front porch. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, the sources say it starts with a complete rejection of online outrage. They use this specific phrase, common sense and civility.
Common sense and civility.
Right. The text explicitly states that members are expected to handle disagreement with restraint and completely reject performance politics.
Which, playing devil's advocate here, that sounds a bit like a generic slogan. Like, hey, let's all just be nice to each other. Is there more to it than just good manners?
There definitely is. When you actually dig into their breakdown of values in the text, it is much more strategic. They separate things into two distinct categories. You have Jeffersonian principles and you have Jeffersonian values.
Okay, let's unpack that difference.
Yeah.
What are the principles versus the values?
So think of the principles as the hardware. That is the classic civics class stuff.
Like local self-government.
Yes, local self-government, limited delegated power, the consent of the governed. That is the structure of the house. But the values, that is the software running on the hardware.
And what does the software look like in this analogy?
It is personal responsibility. It's civic restraint, independent judgment, and moral self-discipline.
So the argument they are making is that the political hardware simply does not work if the cultural software is glitchy.
Exactly. And the text makes a really fascinating economic argument here, too. It says that economic freedom and liberty are not just about passing laws to cut taxes or reduce
I need
regulations.
a foundation.
Right, they require moral grounding.
Can you give me an example of that connection from the text? How do they link the two?
Sure, think about a basic contract. If you do not trust your neighbor to pay you back or to just tell the truth, you cannot have a free market transaction.
Because the trust isn't there.
Right, and without that trust, you need a third party, usually the government, to step in and force everyone to behave properly.
Ah, I see.
So the source material argues that if you want less government, which is the ultimate Jeffersonian ideal, you actually need more personal self-discipline.
That is a really sticky insight. There's a quote from the text that stood out to me. Power must rise from communities. But for power to actually rise, the community has to be capable of wielding it in the first place.
Exactly. If everyone is just screaming at each other online, they are not capable of self-governance. They are just creating noise.
So the front porch isn't just an aesthetic. It's not just about relaxing.
No, it is about building the actual trust required to govern yourselves locally.
Okay, so that establishes the why. That is the philosophical bedrock of this whole network. But obviously, you and I can't just live inside a philosophy. We need to know what to actually do.
Which is where the tools come in.
Right. The documents talk a lot about an engine of action.
Yeah.
This is where we get into that book I mentioned earlier, Mega 2.0.
Mm.
Now, we should address the elephant in the room here. Mega is obviously a highly politically charged term tied to Donald Trump and the right wing.
It is.
Does the source material just lean into standard partisan politics, or is it doing something else with that phrase?
It is actually doing something quite distinct from standard national politics. The documents heavily frame this as the 2.0 version, and the subtitle of the book is the really critical part to understand their angle.
What is the subtitle?
No permission needed.
No permission needed. That sounds like a major shift in mindset.
It is a huge shift. The text is essentially critiquing what historians call the great man theory of politics.
The idea that if we just elect the right savior at the very top, everything magically gets fixed.
Exactly. The MAGA 2.0 excerpt argues that the real work of self-governance is local, it's unglamorous, and crucially, it does not require you to get a permit or approval from some central authority.
This leads us straight into the concept of blueprints, which they talk about constantly.
Yeah.
I loved this part of the source material because it felt so tangible.
It is very practical.
Because usually when organizations talk about grassroots action, they just mean, go knock on doors for a national candidate.
Mm.
But a blueprint in this ecosystem seems to be something else entirely.
It is. It's almost like an open source code repository, but for civic life. The sources make it clear that a blueprint is not just another political manifesto.
What is it then?
It is a highly practical, step-by-step guide that is based entirely on lived experience from other members.
Okay, paint a picture for me. What does one of these blueprints look like in the wild?
Let's say a member in Ohio successfully navigates a really thorny local school board dispute regarding, say, curriculum transparency.
Which is a huge issue right now.
Right. Instead of just celebrating that local win and moving on, that member documents exactly how they did it.
Like a case study.
Exactly. What specific forms did they have to file? What arguments actually resonated with the other parents in the room? Did they cite any specific legal precedents? All of that documentation gets bundled up and becomes a blueprint.
So if I am a listener sitting in Arizona and I am facing that exact same school board issue, I do not have to start from scratch.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel at all.
I just log in and download the Ohio blueprint.
Exactly. The text says this creates a shared body of practical knowledge. And they mention blueprints for all sorts of things, from starting a local charity to handling tricky zoning issues to even just applying these values at your own family dinner table.
It's really about building capacity. That feels like the key differentiator to me.
Oh.
It is not about raising awareness.
Oh, definitely not.
Because I feel like raising awareness is usually just code for, well, I posted an angry article on my feed and now I am going to take a nap.
Yeah, the text is very critical of that mindset. This
Yeah.
is entirely about capacity. And that ties right back to the whole no permission needed concept. If you have the blueprint in your hands, you don't need a national organization to authorize your local chapter.
You don't need to wait for a grant to come through.
You just look at the instructions and you get to work in your own town.
It reminds me a bit of the maker movement, with 3D printing and open source schematics, but applied to civics.
Yeah.
It's DIY democracy.
That is a perfect analogy, DIY democracy. But as anyone who does DIY projects knows, it can be pretty lonely work.
You're just out there in your garage by yourself.
Or sitting on your front porch on your own. And that is why the ecosystem they describe also heavily emphasizes the connection piece.
Which brings us to the podcasts and the forums.
Right.
Let's talk about the content they are producing. Because honestly, if I hear the phrase political podcast, my brain immediately assumes it is just going to be an hour of someone ranting about the headlines from this morning. Is that what they're offering here?
The source material is very explicit about this. They say, quote, "We do not do that." They state clearly that their Whitley audio content is not a rehash of the daily news cycle.
Thank goodness for that. I think we are all pretty overdosed on breaking news alerts.
The stated goal of their content is perspective, not just rapid-fire information. They list the types of topics they cover, and it's things like natural, God-given rights, the consequences of dependency culture, and moral foundations.
So they're focusing on evergreen concepts.
Exactly. You could listen to one of these episodes in 2024 or in 2030, and the core argument would likely remain completely relevant.
You mentioned the phrase dependency culture just now. That is a pretty loaded term in political circles. How do the documents actually define it?
They define it as the psychological and social atrophy that happens when people rely too heavily on top-down systems.
So it's not just an economic critique.
No, the argument goes way beyond just welfare checks or government spending. It is described as a mindset where citizens default to looking to the state to solve every single problem, from personal health to their children's education.
So the podcast network is essentially designed to deprogram that specific mindset.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It is designed to equip the listeners to think independently. It's a very slow burn content strategy.
They aren't trying to spike your adrenaline with outrage.
Right. They are trying to build up your intellectual foundation over time.
Okay, so that is the audio side. But then you also have the forums, which the documents describe as these live, Zoom-based discussions. Now, I have to play devil's advocate again here.
Go for it.
When you get a group of like-minded political people in a Zoom room together, doesn't it inevitably just devolve into an echo chamber? Just a bunch of people nodding and agreeing that the other side is terrible.
That is a huge risk in any political or civic group, and the source material actually addresses it surprisingly directly.
Oh, really? How do they handle it?
They emphasize that the primary objective of these forums is, and this is a quote, not conformity of thought, but clarity of action.
Clarity of action. I really like that phrasing. What does that imply for the people in the room?
It implies that they really do not care if everyone in the Zoom room perfectly agrees on the microscopic nuance of a specific tax policy.
They just care if you know what to do next.
Exactly. They care if everyone knows how to handle the specific local challenge they are currently facing. It is framed as collaborative problem solving.
So it's less like, let's debate philosophy, and more like, here is my problem, here's the blueprint I am trying to use, but I am stuck, so please help me unstick this.
That is exactly it. It is much less of a lecture hall and much more of a workshop. And while the text mentions these can be led by subject matter experts, it heavily emphasizes that they can also be community-led.
Just peer-to-peer learning.
Right. It is literally just neighbors helping neighbors figure out the actual mechanics of local governance.
Okay, so looking at the whole picture so far, we have got the philosophy with the front porch, we have the tools with the blueprints, and we have the network with the forums and podcasts.
It is a very structured setup.
It is. But then, buried right in the middle of this stack of very serious civic infrastructure documents, we find a cartoon bird.
Ah, yes. Ollie the owl.
I have to admit, I did a double take reading the sources.
Yeah.
We were sitting here talking about Jeffersonian principles and decentralized self-governance, and suddenly we are analyzing a children's book series. Why is Ollie the owl in here?
I know it looks a bit out of place, but this is actually one of the most strategic parts of the entire document stack, even if it looks cute on the surface.
Where does it fit into their plan?
It falls under a section they call Cultivating the Next Generation.
Okay, so it feels like a really long-term play for the network.
It is the longest-term play they have. The source describes this series as applying a Jeffersonian lens to children's stories.
A Jeffersonian lens for kids. Does that mean Ollie the owl is out there writing the Declaration of Independence on a tree stump or something?
Not quite that literal. It is less about historical reenactment and much more about the underlying narrative framing.
How so?
Well, think about most children's books. They all communicate basic values, right? Sharing is good, bullying is bad.
Sure.
The Jeffersonian lens just shifts those underlying values slightly to emphasize things like personal responsibility, independence, and faith.
Oh, I see. So instead of a story where the government, or let's say the king of the forest, swoops in and magically fixes the problem for everyone, the animals have to figure out how to fix it themselves.
Exactly. The network uses these adventure narratives to teach the core values of liberty way before the child is old enough to actually understand the politics of liberty.
That is fascinating.
And the documents also mention that these books come with specific discussion guides meant for the adults reading them.
So it is just as much a tool for the parents as it is for the kids.
Explicitly so. The texts frame parents and grandparents as the first and most important teachers of liberty.
Because if you believe that politics is downstream from culture, you really have to start the culture building at the bedtime story.
Exactly. It provides essential continuity. Think about it. If you have all these great blueprints for the adults, but you lose the kids to that dependency culture we talked about, the whole movement just dies in a single generation.
So Ollie the Owl is essentially their insurance policy against that happening.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked a lot about individuals so far, the concerned parent, the active neighbor. The documents also highlight a very specific use case for existing groups, which they call conservative organizations and local clubs. This is their scaling up section.
Right. And this part addresses a very real, very practical problem in civic life. You have run local clubs before, right? What is always the hardest part?
Oh, the content. Absolutely the content. You do all this work to get everyone to show up on a Tuesday night, you buy the coffee and the donuts, and then you suddenly realize you have to entertain and educate them for 90 minutes.
And eventually you just run out of local speakers to invite.
And that is exactly where the burnout sets in for the organizers.
Well, the Jeffersonian community pitches itself as a turnkey framework specifically for those existing groups.
Like Rotary clubs or local political chapters.
Exactly. Any local civic group.
So they don't have to invent the wheel every single month just to keep the meeting going.
Right. They can just pull down the blueprints and use them as instant discussion guides. Or they can assign one of the podcast episodes as homework for the members and then debate it at the next meeting.
It turns this national network into a resource hub rather than a competitor.
Yes, a massive content library.
That is really smart. Because so often, these big national networks try to swoop into a town and say, hey, abandon your old group and join our brand new chapter.
Yeah.
And they just end up fighting with the local group that has already been there for 30 years.
The source text explicitly warns against that. They emphasize local autonomy above almost everything else. They are very clear that they are not a command center issuing marching orders from the top down.
They just want to provide the tools.
The phrasing they use is that they allow local clubs to select, adapt, and implement based entirely on their own unique needs.
So if a local club in rural Texas is really worried about property rights, they just pulled that specific blueprint. But if a club in suburban Chicago is totally focused on school board elections, they pull a completely different one.
Correct. The goal stated in the text is to move these local clubs from passive concern to constructive local action.
Because passive concern is basically just a group of people sitting in a circle complaining about the news.
Right. This framework gives them an actual job to do.
And giving people a job to do is really the best way to keep them engaged long term. People fundamentally want to feel useful in their communities.
Useful is definitely the key word here. Going back to their critique of the spectacle of national politics and the spectacle, we are completely useless. We are just passive viewers.
But in this Jeffersonian ecosystem, we are supposed to be the builders.
Exactly.
Let's try to synthesize this whole living ecosystem before we wrap up, because there really are a lot of moving parts in these documents. How does it all fit together for a single person engaging with it?
The best way to think of it is as a continuous loop.
Okay, a loop. Break that down for me.
First, you have the podcasts, which provide the intellectual grounding. That is the why.
Got it.
Then you have the blueprints, which provide the tools for action. That is the how.
Right, the step-by-step guides.
Then you have the forums, which provide the support network and the peer-to-peer learning. That is the who.
And finally,
You have Ollie the Owl and the children's resources, which ensure the future continuity. That is the win.
it really is a completely self-sustaining system when you lay it out like that. It runs all the way from the toddler reading the adventure book to the grandparent running the local meeting using the downloaded blueprint.
It does. And the consistent thread running through every single piece of that loop is the explicit rejection of hype and guesswork in favor of what the text calls discernment and leadership.
Discernment. You know, that is a word that feels almost totally extinct in modern political culture.
Yeah.
The algorithm is literally designed to destroy discernment. It just wants an immediate emotional reaction.
That is the core conflict highlighted in these sources, reaction versus discernment. Reaction is incredibly easy. It takes 1 second to click share on a rage bait article.
But discernment is hard work.
It is very hard. It requires sitting on that front porch, actually reading through a complex blueprint, talking face-to-face with a neighbor you might actually disagree with, and doing the tedious, slow work of real governance.
It completely challenges the listener to rethink what political action actually means today. Because we are so deeply trained to think that being political means posting a graphic online, or donating $20 to a national candidate, or holding a protest sign.
But the Jeffersonian community documents argue that those things are often just noise.
They are part of the spectacle.
Right. They suggest that we have essentially outsourced our political power to these massive, distant institutions, and we have outsourced our actual thinking to cable news pundits.
And their proposed solution is a full retreat to the local level.
A reinvestment in the things within your immediate physical reach.
It is a very empowering thought, honestly, but it is also a highly convicting one, because the local level is where things get really messy. It is so much easier to be mad at a politician on a screen than it is to confront a difficult zoning problem on your own street.
It is, but the text argues that the local level is the only place where real, lasting impact actually happens, and that is exactly what this entire ecosystem is built to support and scale.
So, given all of that, here is the final thought I want to leave you with today. We live in an era that is completely defined by the screen. By the global, the national, the massive, unmanageable scale of online outrage.
It is the water we swim in.
But when you look at these documents and you really look at this front porch philosophy they're building, you have to ask yourself a pretty serious question.
In a world that constantly demands you perform for an audience of millions.
Is the most radical political act actually just ignoring the noise, pulling up a chair on your front porch, and fixing what is right in front of you?
It is certainly something you'll want to think about the very next time you reach for your phone in the dark.
That is it for our deep dive into the Jeffersonian community. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time.